The evacuation order came down at 3:40 station time, which meant it was already 6 hours late. I know this now. At the time, I thought we were running ahead of the curve. My name is Rethis-Vann. I hold the rank of Senior Extraction Officer, 3rd Tier, Keth Survey Authority, which means when a research installation needs to be emptied ahead of a scheduled environmental event, they send me. I have cleared 14 platforms, 11 surface outposts, and 1 deep-bore facility that the authority had forgotten it owned. I am, by the standards of my institution, very good at my job. I want to say that plainly before I say anything else, because what follows is not a record of failure. It is, as accurately as I can set it down, a record of a misunderstanding. One I did not recognize as a misunderstanding until the bloom was already at its peak, at which point there was nothing left to do but stand in a maintenance corridor and log pressure values on a scheduled tessay Mar dictated to me. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me begin where things begin, with the approach. Platform 19 orbits in the upper atmospheric band of Rethis-Vann, which the Keth Survey Authority classifies as Category 23 on the Environmental Hazard Scale. The category is assigned exclusively for bloom season, which runs from the 41st day of the calendar's second quarter to somewhere between the 82nd and the 90th, depending on wind shear conditions in the mesosphere. During the remaining months of the year, Rethis-Vann is technically habitable, or at least survivable, which the authority considers the same thing. The planet's surface is a broad gray-green ocean of something that is neither gas nor solid but behaves like both. A fungal mat, effectively, though that description leaves out the depth and the motion and the smell, which I am told from surface reports is difficult to describe and impossible to forget. During bloom season, the mat exhales. That is not the official language. The official language describes a cyclic atmospheric pressure event driven by reproductive spore ejection from the Rethis fungal substrate, resulting in particulate densities and pressure wave cascades exceeding all Class 14 survival ratings. The official language is correct and nearly useless if you want to understand what actually happens. What actually happens is this. Over the course of 3 to 8 days, the entire surface of the planet breathes out. The spore front moves upward through the atmosphere in a series of pressure pulses, each one stronger than the last, until the upper band, where platform 19 is anchored, takes the full load. The platform's anchoring grid is rated for the event. The Keth Survey officers stationed there are not. This is why, every year, I come to collect them. I have made the crossing to platform 19 7 times over my career. The first time, I was a junior officer assisting a senior extraction lead who had done it a dozen times before. He walked me through the approach during the transit, explaining the bloom cycle in the patient tone of someone who has given the same briefing often enough that it no longer requires active thought. What I remember most from that first crossing is not the briefing but the view from the shuttle window as we entered the lower atmospheric band. A darkness that was not space dark, not the clean absence of light, but a density, a granularity, as though the air itself had thickened to the consistency of particulate matter, which is, more or less, what it had done. The second time, I made the crossing alone as the lead officer, and I understood for the first time why the senior officer's tone had been so patient. The briefing is simple. The crossing is not frightening, exactly. It is something else, a kind of deliberate passage through an environment that has very clear opinions about what belongs in it, and you are relying entirely on the hull between you and those opinions. By the 7th crossing, I had stopped noticing the view. I processed the particulate interference reading, overrode the sensor flag, and logged the approach time. I had 6 officers with me on the extraction shuttle, 4 field-rated, 2 logistics. All 6 were in full atmospheric sealing before we made the crossing. The bloom front had already reached the lower band. We could see it from the shuttle windows, a dark upwelling of gray-brown haze that moved with more intention than weather should have. The shuttle's environmental sensors were flagging particulate interference at a level that required manual override to proceed. I overrode it. That is what senior officers do. Platform 19 appeared on the forward display at 4:12, and the first thing I noticed was that the exterior lights on the lower observation ring were still running. This was irregular. Evacuation protocol calls for non-essential lighting to be cut at stage 2 of the exit sequence, which should have been completed by 200. I noted it and did not think much of it. Platforms get disorganized during evacuations. Things get left running. The second thing I noticed, as we maneuvered to the docking collar on the station's upper arm, was that the docking queue was empty. I had expected to meet at least 2 or 3 of the platform's research teams still waiting for the second extraction shuttle. Instead, the collar was clean. The dock log showed 12 departures over the preceding 6 hours, the full Keth complement, staggered across the available shuttle windows as the Bloom front climbed. Which meant the platform was empty, except that the lower ring lights were still on. I sent one officer ahead to do a sweep while the rest of us secured the docking environment. He came back 4 minutes later and reported, with the careful flatness of a man who is not entirely sure what he has seen, that there was a human in the observation ring. She was sitting at a data terminal, he said. She had food. She appeared to be working. I want to record, for the sake of accuracy, that my first thought was that she had sustained some kind of cognitive disruption from Bloom front exposure. Early-phase spore intrusion can cause confusion, disorientation, impaired judgment. It would explain why she had not taken one of the 12 departure windows. It would explain why she appeared, by all accounts, to be calm. I went down myself. The observation ring on Platform 19 is a pressurized corridor that runs the full circumference of the station's lower section. Its outer wall a continuous band of thick transparent panels, giving an unobstructed view of the atmospheric band below. During normal operating conditions, it is the most pleasant part of the platform, good light, good sightlines, the kind of open horizon that makes long-duration posting more bearable. During bloom season, with the front already moving through the lower band, the view is something else entirely. The panels were showing a wall of dark particulate that caught the platform's running lights and scattered them in slow, shifting patterns like watching smoke move through deep water. Up close, against the thickness of it, the bloom front had a quality I had not expected. It was not uniform. It moved in structures, long, slow channels and convective columns, the way a body moves when it is driven by something internal rather than pushed by wind. I had processed the official language enough times to know what I was looking at. Seeing it was different from knowing what it was. Tessa Mar was sitting at the third terminal from the North Junction, a folded ration wrapper on the desk beside her, a handwritten data sheet weighted down by her stylus under one elbow, and a live sensor feed running across 4 display panels in front of her. She was annotating something. She had one knee pulled up onto the chair, and the posture gave her an angular, concentrated look, as though she had forgotten the chair was a chair and was using it as a surface to think from. She did not look up when I came in. I said her name. She held up one finger, not a rude gesture I would come to understand, but a functional one. She was in the middle of a notation and she did not want to lose the number, and finished what she was writing, then turned around in the chair and looked at me with the kind of expression that says it is perfectly aware that another person has arrived and is simply unclear on what that person needs. "Extraction team," I said. I had my authority badge on the front of my sealing suit, but she clearly did not need it. She looked at the badge, then back at my face. "I know," she said. "I filed a waiver." I told her I was not aware of a waiver. "I filed it 3 days ago," she said. "Standard Attachment 7, Specialist Continuation Authorization, Environmental Event, Ongoing Research Necessity." I cited sections 4 through 9 of the survey mandate. There are signatures. Delith countersigned it before he left on the 200 window. I did not know who Delith was at that moment. I would learn later that he was the platform's departing garrison commander, a senior Keth administrator who had, apparently, reviewed Tessa Mar's waiver request, determined that the authority's specialist continuation provisions technically permitted a credentialed survey researcher to remain in a sealed environment during a Category 23 Bloom event, countersigned the form, and then boarded his shuttle without mentioning any of this to the authority's regional dispatch desk. Which was how I had come to arrive at Platform 19, expecting to collect 12 Keth officers, and found instead one human eating dried rations in the observation ring. I said I would need to contact regional dispatch to confirm the waiver's status. Of course, Tessa said. She turned back to her terminal. I want to be clear that she was not rude. She was not dismissive or contemptuous or performing the kind of deliberate unhelpfulness that occasionally appears in survey staff who believe their research is more important than operational protocols. She was simply finished with that part of the conversation. She had answered my question. She was now doing something else. I went to the communications bay and spent 22 minutes trying to reach regional dispatch, which was experiencing what the automated response described as elevated contact volume due to the current seasonal event cycle. I left a priority flag on the waiver confirmation request and went back to the observation ring. She had not moved. 3 more lines had appeared on the handwritten sheet. "How long do you intend to remain?" I asked. She checked something on the handwritten sheet under her elbow. The peak pressure wave should clear the upper band in approximately 60 to 70 hours. I'll need another 4 days after that to complete the final measurement series and pack the physical samples. So roughly 6 days total, if the upper band shear doesn't push the back end longer than my models predict. The platform is not rated for extended single occupancy during bloom season, I said. She looked at me again, and I had the distinct sensation, which I would have several more times over the course of the next 3 days, that she was doing a kind of rapid internal accounting, deciding how much of what she knew was worth transferring to me and how quickly she could do it. "The platform is rated for the bloom," she said. "The Keth occupants are not. That's why the evacuation order exists. My physiology is different." She said it the way someone states a fact about air pressure, not a boast, just a number. "The filtration seals will hold. I've been breathing filtered station air since day 2 of the pre-bloom period. I've been monitoring the particulate ingestion rate every 4 hours. I'm within tolerance. The anchoring grid may experience stress events during the pressure cascade," I said. She nodded. "Yes, that's actually the main reason I need to stay." I waited for her to continue. She looked at me for a moment as if deciding whether I had the technical background to make the explanation worth giving, then apparently decided that giving it was faster than not giving it. "The platform's automated grid stabilization runs off sensor readings from the exterior array," she said. "During a standard pressure event, those readings are reliable enough. During a bloom of this magnitude, the spore particulate interferes with the exterior sensors. They start reading false positives in the pressure data, which causes the stabilization system to overcorrect, which puts asymmetric stress on the anchor cables, which can cause a secondary oscillation pattern that the automated system then also overcorrects for, and so on, until you get a resonance cascade that the grid wasn't designed for." She picked up her handwritten sheet and held it toward me briefly. It was covered in numbers and bloom cycle notation in a shorthand I did not recognize. "I've been tracking the sensor drift pattern for 3 months. I know which readings to discount and when and by how much. The automated system doesn't know that. It will follow the false data." I looked at the sheet. I am an extraction officer, not an atmospheric systems specialist, and I want to say that plainly also. What I could read of the notation looked dense and precise, and entirely unlike what a person in cognitive disruption from spore exposure would produce. The handwriting itself was part of it, compact, economical, the kind of script that has stopped caring how it looks and only cares how much it can fit on the page. "You are telling me," I said carefully, "that if I extract you, the platform's anchoring system may fail during the bloom peak." "Not certainly," she said. "Probably. The resonance cascade I'm describing is a conditional outcome. It depends on how the upper band shear develops over the next 24 hours. If the shear stays low, the sensor drift won't be significant enough to matter, and the automated system will manage fine. If the shear runs high, the way my last 3 models predict, the sensor drift will start about 8 hours before peak, and the stabilization system will start making corrections that make things worse rather than better. And by peak pressure, it will have put enough asymmetric load on the northeastern quadrant anchor cables that something will give." She paused. "The platform has 73 years of Keth Survey data on it. Environmental records, species catalogs, atmospheric measurements going back to the original survey mission. If the northeastern anchor gives, the grid fails asymmetrically. The station doesn't fall, it's not that simple, but the observation ring decompresses, the data core loses primary power, and you spend the next 8 months recovering records that were damaged in a preventable event." She turned back to her terminal. I stood there for a moment. "You filed the waiver 3 days ago," I said. "Yes." "Before you had confirmed that regional dispatch had cleared it." "I filed it correctly," she said, which was not, I noticed, the same answer. "Delith countersigned, the form is on file." I went back to the communications bay. My second attempt to reach regional dispatch took 31 minutes and connected me to a junior routing clerk who confirmed that a specialist continuation authorization had been filed by one Tesse Mar, Survey Certification Class 1, attached to the Rethis-Vann Atmospheric Survey Program, and that the form's current status in the system was pending administrator review, which is the status that forms acquire when the administrator who should review them has already boarded an evacuation shuttle, and the regional office is dealing with a Category 23 bloom event across 11 active survey installations simultaneously. I asked whether a pending form constituted authorization. The clerk told me that, technically, a properly filed and countersigned specialist continuation authorization that had not been denied was not a denied authorization. I asked whether that meant it was an approved authorization. The clerk said he was not qualified to make that determination. I went back to the observation ring. Outside the panels, the bloom front had risen another band. The particulate wall was thicker now, and the patterns it made in the running lights had slowed, the way things slow when there is more of them. The environmental sensors along the ring's instrument rail were updating every 30 seconds, and even I could see that the readings were jumping in ways that looked irregular. I stood at the instrument rail for several minutes trying to read the data the way I imagined she was reading it, and found that I could not. The numbers meant something. I was not equipped to read what they meant. The sensor array had 12 active channels, and the values on several of them were moving in different directions at different rates, and the relationship between those movements and the physical event happening outside the panels was a translation I did not have. She had that translation. She had built it, apparently, over 11 months. Tesse was still at the terminal. She had added 3 more lines to her handwritten sheet. She had also moved the ration wrapper to the far edge of the desk, which I understood as signaling, to no one in particular, that the eating portion of the morning was concluded. I sat down at the next terminal over. My extraction team had secured the docking collar and were waiting in the upper arm, monitoring the shuttle systems. There was nothing for them to do yet. There was nothing for me to do yet. I watched her work. She worked the way certain people work who have spent a very long time alone with a problem that they find genuinely interesting. She was not frantic. She was not performing efficiency. She moved between her terminal and the handwritten sheet with a kind of settled rhythm, the way you move through a space that you know well enough that you stop thinking about moving through it. Occasionally, she would reach across to the sensor panel on the instrument rail and pull a reading manually, and I could see her compare it to something on her sheet, and most of the time she would note it and move on, but twice in the first hour she made a correction to something. I could not see what from my angle, and then watched the sensor feed for the next several minutes until whatever she was watching settled back into range. At 6:30, she made herself a second ration pack using water from the ring's emergency cache, which she had apparently been doing throughout her posting here. She did it with the automatic efficiency of someone who has repeated an action enough times that the action no longer requires attention, her eyes still on the sensor feed while her hands worked the seal on the ration container. She offered me nothing, which was not rudeness. I was in a sealed suit, and she had no way of knowing whether I ate during operational deployment. She simply forgot that hospitality was a possible category of interaction, which told me something about the texture of her 11 months here. "You said the sensor drift starts 8 hours before peak," I said. "About 8 hours, maybe 6 if the shear runs high." "What do you do when it starts?" She finished chewing, set the ration container down, and explained it to me in the same flat, information-dense way she had explained the resonance cascade. The platform's stabilization system drew its correction data from 16 exterior sensor arrays, arranged in a ring around the station's equatorial band. During bloom, the lower 6 arrays began to read false high due to particulate accumulation on the sensor surfaces. The bloom spores were not just atmospheric, they were adhesive, which was part of their reproductive mechanism, the adhesion allowing them to anchor to whatever solid surface they contacted in the upper atmosphere long enough to complete the reproductive cycle. As the adhesive layer built up on the exterior sensors, those sensors registered increasing pressure where there was in fact only particulate mass. The stabilization system, reading that false pressure, would begin paying out cable on the high-pressure side and tensioning cable on the low-pressure side, trying to balance a gradient that did not exist. Over the course of the bloom peak, 4 to 6 hours, this produced a growing asymmetric load on the anchor grid. In a standard bloom year, the shear was low enough that the false readings were small enough that the asymmetric load never reached critical levels. In a high shear year, which her models suggested this was with high probability, the false readings would be large enough that critical load on the northeastern quadrant was a conditional probability rather than a hypothetical. What she would do was manually discount the lower 6 arrays from the stabilization calculation at the point when her sensor logs showed them beginning to drift. She had already written the override parameters. She had tested them in the platform's simulator twice. She had a secondary set of parameters ready if the primary override did not hold, calibrated against a more extreme drift scenario. She had a manual correction schedule for the cable tension in the northeastern quadrant that she would run herself, from the lower access panels in the maintenance corridor, during the peak pressure window. The schedule was based on a predictive model she had developed from 3 months of baseline cable tension readings, cross-referenced against the sensor drift pattern, and the upper band shear forecasts she had been compiling since the pre-bloom period began. She said all of this in approximately the time it took to eat a ration pack. She said it without defensiveness, and without the particular cadence that people use when they are explaining something to someone they believe will not understand it. She said it the way you say things to someone who has asked a technical question and deserves a technical answer. I asked her how long she had been planning for this. "Since month 4, she said. "The first set of sensor readings that showed the drift pattern. I reported it in my quarterly data submission. The authority acknowledged receipt. They didn't act on it." "No," she looked at the sensor panel. "They classified my note as an equipment maintenance flag. The maintenance schedule puts sensor servicing at the post-bloom window, which is correct procedure. Servicing during bloom would compromise the sensor seals. But the flag didn't include the analysis of what the drift pattern would mean for the stabilization system during a high shear event, because quarterly data submissions have a word limit, and my analysis ran long. I filed the full analysis separately, as a supplemental technical memorandum, which the authority acknowledged receipt, she said. She said it without bitterness. She said it the way she said everything, as a fact that existed in the world and had to be accounted for, the same as a pressure reading or a sensor drift coefficient. I sat with that for a while. Did you know, I said carefully, when you filed the quarterly submission, that it would be classified as a maintenance flag rather than a structural risk assessment? She thought about it honestly, which I had already come to understand was how she thought about things, not performing consideration, but actually doing it. I thought it was possible, she said. The routing logic for the submission system categorizes by keyword. The primary keywords in my note were sensor, drift, and maintenance, so the routing would naturally send it to the maintenance queue rather than the structural integrity queue. I should have led with anchor cable and resonance before I used the word sensor. She paused. I know that now. At the time, I was trying to be accurate about what I had observed, which meant describing the observation before the implication. She picked up her stylus and made a small notation on her sheet. I corrected the language in the supplemental memorandum. But the supplemental memorandum is in the research submission queue, she said, which routes to the research review desk, which has a different priority schedule than the structural integrity desk. I looked at the sensor feed. The values were still doing what they had been doing for the last hour, which was moving in ways that communicated urgency to some part of my mind and nothing specific to my training. So both submissions arrived at desks that were not the desk that would have acted on them, I said. Yes. And you knew this by the time you filed the supplemental memorandum. I suspected it. There was no way to be certain without seeing the routing log, which I don't have access to. She made another notation. But yes, by month 6, I suspected the memorandum had not reached the people who could have modified the algorithm. Month 6, I said. You've been here 11 months. Yes. I let that sit for a moment. 5 months of knowing that the correct people had probably not read the analysis. 5 months of continuing to develop and refine the model, extending the baseline, tightening the predictions. 5 months between that quiet conclusion and the bloom season. The waiver, I said. Yes. You filed it because you were the only one who knew what to do if the shear ran high. I filed it, she said, because someone needed to be here if the shear ran high, and I was the only one who knew what to do, and the form exists for exactly that kind of situation, and the form was correct. She said it without any emphasis. She was not making a case. She was describing the logic of it. Sections 4 through 9 of the survey mandate were written to account for situations where a specialist's continued presence during an environmental event is the factor that protects survey infrastructure rather than endangers it. The people who wrote those sections were thinking of situations like this one. She went back to her terminal. At 8:30, the sensor readings on the lower arrays started to move. Tessa was watching them before I was. She had her handwritten sheet out, and she was comparing the readings against a column of numbers I could now see were timestamp projections. She had predicted the drift onset, and she was now confirming it against the actual data with the neutral focus of someone checking that a scheduled event has arrived on schedule. Sooner than the median, she said, high shear event. The primary override parameters will apply. She stood up, picked up the handwritten sheet and the toolkit she had apparently had at her feet under the terminal the entire time, and looked at me. I'm going to need access to the lower stabilization panels. They're in the maintenance corridor under the northeastern quadrant. Platform layout has them as access code 7-4. Do you have override authority for locked maintenance corridors? I did. I briefed my team via communicator. We would not be launching on the current clearance window. They were to hold position and monitor shuttle systems, and walked her there. I coded open the maintenance corridor hatch, which descended into the station's lower structural section through a ladder access rated for routine maintenance in non-bloom conditions. Tessay went down without hesitation. I followed. The corridor was narrower than the observation ring, the lighting a flat institutional white. The cable management runs visible along both walls in exposed conduit that had the particular look of infrastructure designed to be serviced, not admired. It smelled of sealed metal and the faint sharp smell of filtration, compound working harder than usual. The floor had a slight give to it from the platform's oscillation damping, which I had not noticed in the upper sections but was perceptible down here, where you were closer to the anchor structure. Tessay went directly to a specific panel on the northeastern wall, not the closest panel, not the largest panel, a specific one approximately 11 meters down the corridor from the hatch, and opened it with the efficiency of someone who has opened it many times before. The cable tension monitors inside were already reading elevated on the northeastern array. I could see the numbers. Even I could tell that the numbers were moving in the wrong direction, climbing steadily against a set of baseline values marked in red on the monitor face. "Did you come down here during your normal work?" I asked. "Once a month," she said, "monitoring baseline, and after the quarterly submission, when I wanted to confirm that the drift pattern translated to actual cable tension data the way the models predicted." She connected a manual readout to the panel and began checking values against her handwritten sheet. It did. She began working through the override parameters. This was not fast or simple work. The stabilization system's input interface had not been designed with manual override in mind. It was designed to accept automated sensor data, and redirecting it to accept manually entered values required working through several layers of access that were, technically, outside the normal operational scope of a survey specialist. She had apparently applied for extended access certification 6 months earlier, citing her ongoing structural monitoring program. The certification had been granted, the documentation confirmed, and the access had been sitting in her personnel record ever since, unused, waiting for a high-shear bloom season. I watched her work through the layers. She moved quickly but not hurriedly, the way you move through something you have practiced. She spoke occasionally, not to me but to herself, reading values aloud as she entered them, a habit of accuracy. When a value was wrong, she went back to the handwritten sheet and checked, found the discrepancy, corrected it, moved on. She did not curse. She did not show frustration. She noted the errors and addressed them. There was something clarifying about watching her in the maintenance corridor that I had not felt in the observation ring. In the observation ring, she had been sitting at a terminal, which looks like any research work. In the corridor, she was crouched at an open panel in a sealed environment during a Category 23 atmospheric event, adjusting anchor cable parameters on a manual correction schedule. She had developed herself over the course of 8 months of baseline monitoring that nobody had asked her to do. The difference between the two images was, I found, significant. The first one could be explained several ways. The second one had only one explanation. At 9:47, the primary override engaged. On the monitor face, the climbing cable tension values stopped climbing. They stabilized for approximately 40 minutes as the stabilization system began using Tessay's clean manual inputs rather than the corrupted exterior sensor data. Then they began to move again, but controlled this time, managed, tracking the actual pressure environment rather than the phantom one the exterior sensors were reporting. "That's holding," she said, and made a notation on her sheet and looked at the next column of values. The drift window, the period between the drift onset and the bloom peak, ran approximately 9 hours. During those 9 hours, Tessay ran cable tension corrections from the maintenance corridor panel on a schedule that shortened as the bloom front climbed. At 20-minute intervals in the first 3 hours, then 15, then 10, then 8 during the final approach to peak. Each correction required reading the manual readout, comparing the value to her projected schedule, determining whether a correction was needed and in what direction, entering the override parameters through the access interface, confirming the result, and logging it. I helped from the second hour onward. She asked without ceremony whether I had a data recorder. I did. She told me what to log and when. I logged it. The work was not complex on my end. It required attention and accuracy and the willingness to hold a position in a maintenance corridor for hours and call out numbers on demand. These are things I can do. I do not say this to make my role sound more significant than it was. I say it because being useful to her was a particular experience, and I want to record it accurately. She did not perform efficiency, but she was efficient. She did not perform calm, but she was calm. These are not the same thing. People who perform calm have a quality of self-consciousness about it. They are watching themselves be calm, narrating their own composure. Tessa was simply not frightened, which meant there was no composure to perform. She was doing the work required at the pace the work required with the resources available. At 13:12, the first secondary correction became necessary. The upper band shear had pushed slightly above her median projection, and one of the northeastern cable arrays began to drift faster than her primary schedule accounted for. She reviewed the secondary parameter set for approximately 90 seconds, confirmed it fit the current readings, and implemented it without, as far as I could tell, any particular internal adjustment. She updated her handwritten sheet, wrote a new correction schedule for the next 4 hours, and handed me the updated timing so I would know when to prompt the next log entry. "How far above the median?" I asked. "About 12%, she said, "within the secondary parameter range." "Had you modeled that scenario?" "Yes," she checked the monitor face. "Month 8. I had 3 weeks of above-median shear readings that summer, and the models started showing that the primary parameters wouldn't be sufficient if the peak shear ran at the high end, so I built the secondary set." "In month 8? "Yes." "Of 11? "Yes." She said it without the tone people use when they want you to notice something. I noticed it anyway. In the 2 hours between the secondary correction and the peak, I had nothing to do except watch the monitor face and log values on her schedule. This gave me time to think, which I was not certain was an advantage. I thought about the 7 crossings I had made to Platform 19. I thought about the 12 Keth officers who had departed in the 6 hours before our arrival, following the evacuation protocol correctly, as they had been trained to do. I thought about the evacuation protocol itself, which was correct, which accounted for the right things, which protected Keth personnel from a Category 23 atmospheric event. And I tried to identify where in the protocol there was space for the information that Tessa Mar had spent 11 months developing. There was no space. The protocol assumed a homogeneous personnel risk. Everyone on the platform was at risk from the bloom, therefore everyone left. The protocol did not include a conditional branch for the scenario in which one member of the platform's complement had spent 11 months developing a unique understanding of a structural failure mode that would only manifest during peak pressure, and whose continued presence during the event was therefore a net safety benefit rather than a net safety risk. The protocol was not wrong. It simply did not contain that case. Tessa had found the form that contained it, Attachment 7. Sections 4 through 9. I logged values on her schedule and thought about that. The bloom peaked at 1740. The exact time I know because I was watching the primary pressure gauge on the maintenance corridor's environmental display when the reading crested. It was not a dramatic number to look at. It was a number on a gauge. What it meant, in terms of the atmospheric event occurring outside the platform's hull, the full respiratory exhalation of a planetary-scale fungal substrate, the particle density and pressure wave energy moving through the upper band, was something I understood only abstractly, the way you understand the size of an ocean from a map. From inside the maintenance corridor, what the peak felt like was a low, continuous vibration in the floor and walls, Not quite a sound and not quite a sensation, but something between the two. The lights did not flicker. The platform did not shudder in the dramatic way that records of structural events tend to describe. It simply vibrated steadily, and the cable tension monitors climbed to numbers that I suspect were very close to the limits of what the northeastern anchor array was rated for. And then, over the course of about 90 minutes, as the peak pressure pulse moved through the upper band and began to dissipate, they came back down. Tessa made her final scheduled correction at 1812. She checked the cable tension monitors for 7 minutes after that, 7 minutes of watching values, comparing to her sheet, watching values again. And then she closed the panel and disconnected the manual readout and put it back in her toolkit and stood up. "That's the peak," she said. "The back end will be slower." She climbed back up the ladder to the maintenance corridor hatch, and I followed her, and we walked back through the lower section to the observation ring. Neither of us said anything during that walk. I was thinking about the cable tension monitors, and about the number on the pressure gauge, and about what both of them would have read if the stabilization system had been following the corrupted exterior sensor data for the last 9 hours. I could not calculate it precisely. I did not need to. The lower section of Platform 19 connects the maintenance corridor to the observation ring through a 40-meter passage that runs alongside the station's primary structural spine. The structural spine is visible through a mesh barrier on one side of the passage, exposed conduit, reinforced cable runs, the anchor grid interface hardware in a row of gray-green housings that I had never looked at closely before. I looked at them closely now. The northeastern quadrant housings had a set of load indicators on their faces, simple mechanical gauges, the kind that don't need power, and the indicators were sitting at nominal, green bands, standard range. I stopped for a moment and looked at them. Tessa was 3 steps ahead of me. She noticed I had stopped and looked back. "Nominal," she confirmed, reading the same gauges. "I know," I said. "I was just looking at them." She looked at me for a moment, and then she nodded and kept walking. I caught up. Outside the panels, the bloom front was still thick and moving, but the character of the movement had changed. It was no longer rising. It had crested and was beginning to disperse into the upper mesosphere, which would take days, but the worst of it was past. The patterns in the running lights were different now, less structured, more random, the long convective columns breaking apart into something that looked less intentional and more like weather. Tessa sat back down at the 3rd terminal from the North Junction. She opened a new entry in her survey log and began typing the day's data header with the brisk efficiency of someone beginning a task they have been looking forward to since morning. Then she paused and looked at me with the slightly surprised expression of someone who has just remembered that another person is still in the room. "The extraction shuttle," she said. "Your team, they've been waiting." "They have." "You should go. The shear will diminish over the next 22 hours. There's no reason for your team to hold position through the rest of the bloom period. I can manage the back end alone." "I know," I said. That surprised her slightly. I could see it, a small recalibration, the adjustment you make when someone you have categorized as a logistical problem turns out to have been paying more attention than you expected. "I'll need to file a report," I said, "on the extraction, on why the extraction did not occur as scheduled, on what I observed here." "The waiver form is in the administrative system," she said. "Deleth's countersignature is on file. The supplemental technical memorandum is also on file. The authority for specialist continuation is in sections 4 through 9 of the survey mandate." She was not being defensive. She was giving me the citation locations, as a courtesy, so my report would be accurate. "I'll need to describe what I observed," I said, "not just cite the forms." She looked at me again. I had the impression she was deciding something. "There's a secondary data set," she said, "from the cable tension logs during the peak pressure window. It's the first direct empirical record of the stabilization drift pattern under a high shear bloom event. It confirms the model. If the authority's engineers have that data, they can modify the automated stabilization algorithm so the platform can manage a high shear event without manual correction. She said it without any particular emphasis. It was another fact to be accounted for, the same as the drift onset time and the secondary parameter range. I'll flag it in my next quarterly submission. How long will that take to reach the engineering desk? She thought about it. If it follows the standard routing, 6 to 9 months before a technical review is assigned. Another 2 to 3 quarters before any algorithm modification is prioritized, assuming the routing correctly identifies it as a structural integrity submission rather than a research submission. If I flag it as a field observation attachment to my extraction report, I said, it routes through operational incidents rather than routine research submissions. It reaches the engineering desk in the next review cycle. She was quiet for a moment. I had the impression she was checking the logic of it, the way she checked everything. Yes, she said, that would be faster. Then give me the data set in a format compatible with the operational incident attachment template. She looked at me for another moment, and then she turned to the terminal and began compiling the data set. It took 11 minutes. She transferred it to my suit's field recorder without fanfare. The transfer prompt appeared on my display. I accepted it, and that was the transaction. She went back to her survey log entry. I stood there a moment longer. You said you'll need resupply, I said, for the remaining 6 days. I filed a resupply request with the logistics desk 3 weeks ago. Standard extension protocol. I should have confirmation by now, but the comms volume has been running high. I'll flag it through operational channels when I route the report, I said. It will arrive on the next logistics window. She looked up from the terminal. The small recalibration again, visible this time, not as a change of expression but as a pause before she spoke that had not been there earlier in the day. Thank you, she said. It was the first time she had said it to me. Not because she was ungracious before, she had simply had no occasion to say it, because I had not yet done anything worth thanking. I went to the upper arm to brief my team for departure. I told them we would be launching on the next clearance window. They accepted this without comment. They are professionals, and the situation had been explained to them via communicator during the wait. What I did not tell them, because there was no operational reason to, was what I had been thinking about for the last hour, standing in a maintenance corridor while Tessé-Mar ran cable tension corrections on an 8-minute cycle, and called out values in a flat, even voice that did not change register between the routine corrections and the moment the pressure gauge hit its peak. I had been thinking about the gap. There is always a gap in institutional work between what the institution knows and what the situation requires it to know. Usually this gap is small enough that protocol covers it. Usually the average case is close enough to the actual case that the difference does not matter. In 14 extractions, 11 outposts, and 1 forgotten deep bore facility, I had never stood in a situation where the gap was the whole story. Where what the institution did not know was not a minor footnote, but the operative fact, the single piece of information that determined whether a 73-year survey record survived a high-shear bloom season. The gap in this case had a name. Her name was on the waiver form, which was in the administrative system, which had been pending administrator review since 3 days before I arrived. I had been thinking about what the platform would have been at this moment if I had successfully extracted her. The answer was not complicated. If I had extracted her, if I had invoked my extraction authority, overridden the pending waiver on the grounds of personal safety risk, and physically removed her from Platform 19, the platform would have run through the bloom peak on its automated stabilization system, which would have been drawing its corrections from 6 sensor arrays that were reading corrupt data. The resonance cascade she had described, the one that was conditional on high shear, and it had been high shear, confirmed at 9:30 when the upper band readings came in, 12% above median by 13:12, would have developed. The automated system would have continued correcting toward a pressure gradient that was phantom. By peak, the northeastern anchor cables would have been at critical load. After peak, something would have given. 73 years of survey data. The observation ring. However many thousands of hours of work by however many Keth researchers had built that record. Gone, or damaged badly enough to matter, because a Category 23 bloom event had been classified as a personnel hazard, and therefore, implicitly, not an infrastructure hazard, and no one at the authority had routed a supplemental technical memorandum to the structural integrity desk. Except Tessa Marr had read it, because she had written it. I filed my report from the shuttle. I routed the cable tension data set through the operational incident attachment channel, as I had said I would. I flagged the resupply request through logistics, and it was confirmed for the next available window. I wrote in the narrative section of my extraction report that I had arrived at Platform 19 to extract Survey Specialist Tessa Marr, that I had found her in possession of a valid Specialist Continuation Authorization, correctly filed and countersigned by the departing garrison commander, that I had assessed her as cognitively competent, situationally informed, and in possession of technical knowledge directly relevant to the platform's operational safety during the bloom event, and that I had determined, after observation, that proceeding with the extraction against her stated Specialist Continuation Authorization would have constituted a breach of the survey mandate rather than a fulfillment of it. I wrote that the platform's anchoring grid had been maintained through the peak pressure event without structural incident, and that the post-bloom data set had been transferred to the operational incident routing channel for engineering review. I wrote that Specialist Marr remained on Platform 19 to complete her survey program, per her authorization, and that resupply had been arranged through logistics. In the field notes section, which is technically optional and which I have used perhaps 11 times in my career, I wrote one additional line. I wrote it because I thought it was accurate, and because I thought someone at the engineering desk, or at the regional office, or wherever the report eventually landed, should understand what they were looking at when they read the data set attached to the incident report and tried to work out how it had come to exist. I wrote this was not a personnel management problem. It was a knowledge problem. We did not know what she knew. She knew we did not know. She found the correct form. The shuttle cleared Platform 19's docking collar at 20:33. Through the forward panels, I could see the observation ring lights still running in the lower section, a pale band against the dispersing bloom front. The platform was intact. The northeastern anchor cables were at nominal tension. The data core was powered and running. The structural spine load indicators were reading green, the same green I had seen in the passage on the way back from the maintenance corridor, and I had stood and looked at them for a moment that was longer than it needed to be. She would be at her terminal. She would be on the survey log entry she had started before I left, logging the peak pressure data against the projections she had built over 11 months, confirming or adjusting the model, noting the deviations and what they meant for the back-end period, and what they meant for the next bloom season's predictions. She would finish the entry, and then she would go through the back-end monitoring cycle, and in 6 days she would pack her physical samples and her handwritten sheets and her toolkit and put in a flag for the next crew rotation. She would file a final report through the correct channels in the correct format, with the correct keywords in the correct order, so the routing logic sent it to the structural integrity desk rather than the research submission queue. She had told me this at the hatch when I was leaving. She had revised the language. She had tested the revised keywords against the routing logic documentation before submitting, she said, to confirm the categorization. Of course she had. And somewhere, eventually, 2 review cycles from now, or 3 or 4, an engineer would open the file and read the model and understand what had been sitting in the platform's sensor logs for 3 years, waiting for someone with the patience and the specific formation of attention that the Rethis-Vann assignment had apparently produced in Tessay Mar to finally map it. And they would modify the algorithm. And the platform would be safer, not just in high shear bloom years, but in every bloom year, because the model was complete enough that the automated system could be taught to do what Tessay had done manually in a maintenance corridor during a Category 23 event. That is the shape of how it works. The knowing arrives before the institution is ready for it, and then it waits, filed correctly in the correct format under the correct citation, until someone is ready to open it. Sometimes the someone who eventually opens it is not the same person who filed it. Sometimes the knowing waits a long time. I have thought about that every bloom season since. I am not sure I have thought about it correctly, or that there is a correct way to think about it. I can only say what I observed. What I observed was a human who had spent 11 months learning something that the institution that employed her had not known to learn, who had filed it correctly twice, and had it arrive at the wrong desk twice, and had filed a third time in the form of staying, which required a different kind of correctness. Not keyword routing, but the specific legal language of sections 4 through 9, the countersignature, the timing of the submission. She had found the form that could not be rerouted by keyword logic. She had found it because she had spent 11 months understanding the thing she was trying to describe. And once you understand a thing that clearly, you also understand what you need to do to be heard saying it. I have encountered, in 14 years of extraction work, several people who were unwilling to leave when the protocol said they should leave. Most of them were frightened and not thinking clearly. One was attached to physical property he did not want to abandon. Two were in the early stages of cognitive disruption from environmental exposure. In all of these cases, the extraction protocol was correct, and my job was to apply it. Tessay Mar was not any of those cases. She was not unwilling to leave. She was clear, in everything she said and everything she did not say, that the question of whether she left was separate from the question of whether the platform required her to stay. The first question had an answer that she had already worked out, and the answer was in sections 4 through 9. The second question had an answer that she was working out in real time, on a schedule, in a maintenance corridor, with a handwritten sheet and a toolkit and 11 months of baseline data. The distinction matters, I think. It matters because the protocol is designed to protect people from their own unwillingness to leave, from the attachment, the fear, the cognitive disruption. It is not designed for a person who has assessed the situation clearly and determined that the correct action is to stay, and has found the legal mechanism that permits staying, and has prepared the technical means to make the staying productive rather than merely symbolic. There is no protocol for that kind of person. There is only Attachment 7, which was written by someone who had apparently imagined that such a person might exist. What I think about most is not the maintenance corridor, or the cable tension monitors, or the low vibration in the floor when the bloom peaked and the platform held. What I think about is the observation ring at 4:20, when I first walked in and found her at the terminal, her ration wrapper on the desk, her handwritten sheet under her elbow, the bloom front already rising outside the panels. She had known the extraction team would come. She had prepared for the extraction team. She had the waiver, the counter-signature, the citations, the supplemental memorandum, the extended access certification, the toolkit at her feet. She had not, as far as I could tell, for even a moment considered that this was not worth doing. I do not know what word the authority uses in situations like this. I suspect it uses no particular word. It uses form numbers and routing codes and review cycles and the eventual engineer who opens the corrected submission. I know what I use. I wrote it in the field notes. I have not written anything else there since. She found the correct form,